On this Monday night, who hacked a vital pipeline? The ransomware attack that choked off the flow of fuel and spurred an emergency order from the White House.
These groups are realizing that by targeting industrial companies, they can get higher payouts.
What lessons can Canada learn to keep critical infrastructure and companies safe? Gunned down at Vancouver Airport, what's behind a rash of recent shootings?
This generation of gangsters is taking things to another level.
Plus, hold on tight. The tourists trapped high up in high winds. And making a match.
It was surreal. It was absolutely phenomenal.
A sailor from the doomed Franklin expedition is, for the first time, linked to his descendant.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with the brazen cyber attack that has shut down the biggest pipeline in the United States, cutting off the flow of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Today, the FBI put out a statement pointing the finger at a group of hackers. The FBI says the DarkSide ransomware is responsible for the compromise of the Colonial Pipeline networks. The hack shut down its entire network Friday afternoon. Today, the company said it hopes to be back online by the end of the week. The Colonial Pipeline supplies fuel from the Gulf Coast to the densely populated eastern and southern United States. DarkSide is a known organized group of hackers, mostly based in Russia. It claims it targets profitable private companies and that its goal is to make money, not create problems for society. In the U.S., most critical infrastructure is owned by private companies, and what's happened reveals the reach and the destabilizing power of ransomware attacks. Jackson Proskow has our top story tonight.
4 days after the hack, this critical supply of U.S. energy remains at a standstill, interrupting the daily flow of 2.5 million barrels of diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel, nearly half the supply of the U.S. East Coast.
It's still the first and largest major disruption of energy infrastructure in the United States that is coming from a cyber problem.
On Friday, hackers broke into Colonial Pipeline's business operations and launched a ransomware attack. The company shut down the pipeline to protect the rest of its computers. The FBI says a Russian cyber gang called DarkSide is to blame. It's not clear if the action was state-sponsored.
At this time, we assess that DarkSide is a criminal actor, but that's certainly something that our intelligence community is looking into.
Ransomware attacks are typically about money, not disruption. Hackers encrypt a victim's computer files so they can't be accessed and demand a hefty payment to unlock them.
These groups are realizing that by targeting industrial companies, they can get higher payouts, and the companies are more willing to pay out because they want to return these vital operations.
The U.S. is reeling from a string of more traditional cyber attacks that have exposed vulnerabilities. A water treatment plant in Florida was hacked in what's believed to have been an attempt to poison the water supply. And the U.S. government is still assessing the damage from the massive SolarWinds data breach. Experts see what happened to Colonial as a warning.
One could, with a malicious intent, turn a routine piece of energy infrastructure into a weapon.
Even if the Colonial hack was just about money, it could cause price hikes and supply shortages if it drags on. It's not known how much money the hackers wanted or if Colonial paid the ransom to unlock its computers. Officially, the White House says it's not getting involved because the hack involves a private company. Donna.
All right, Jackson, thanks. Well, no one knows for sure how often ransoms are paid, but it's believed about $18 billion was paid around the world last year. In Canada, it's estimated $797 million was paid in 2020. Ransom demands have increased significantly in this country. As Michael Couteur explains, attackers are also becoming more and more sophisticated.
They probably picked the worst day in our company's history to try and hold us ransom.
Jan Gritskovich and his team were about to submit the largest bid in the company's history. On the morning of April 16th, his employees logged on and realized there was a serious problem with their computer system.
This cell came up and basically said, you've been hacked. If you want to collect your information, basically, here's our email address.
Now, they never responded and never found out how much the hackers wanted. Regular backups of their system helped save most of the information, but the delay in submitting that bid may have cost them a multi-million-dollar contract. And cybersecurity specialists say the timing of that attack was likely well planned.
Wouldn't be atypical for an attacker to understand, be reading your email, watching your network activity, and waiting for the moment where it's going to be most painful for you before implementing the ransomware.
Andrew Loshman says hackers are no longer just kids in their parents' basements. They're sophisticated organizations targeting companies and sometimes schools. In 2016, the University of Calgary was one of hundreds of institutions targeted by malware. Administrators paid the $23,000 ransom after realizing the files being held hostage were way too valuable.
People's lives' work were on those desktops, those laptops, and those servers. And to compromise someone's life work, we just weren't willing to take that risk.
The FBI eventually charged 2 men in Iran for the University of Calgary attack, but there will always be others. As so much of our infrastructure in this country is computerized or digital, some warn our public institutions are vulnerable.
They quite often can't afford the resources. So that quite often you'll see a gap in that area where public sector maybe isn't as well protected as private sector.
Now, experts say cyber criminals are always looking for the easiest target, and the best way to protect yourself is to increase your cybersecurity to make it harder for hackers to get in. Michael Couteur, Global News, Ottawa.
In British Columbia, a gang war is escalating into a series of targeted shootings, including one yesterday afternoon at Vancouver International Airport. When the police pursued the suspects, shots were fired at them too. There have been about a dozen shootings, many in public places, in the last 2 weeks. And as Robin Gill reports, they involve 3 key gangs and a new generation of gangsters.
Vancouver International Airport is a very public place. But that didn't stop the guns from coming out on Sunday afternoon. A known gangster was killed.
This generation of gangsters is taking things to another level, which is having no regard whatsoever with community safety.
There's gunshots. The police tried to pursue the suspected murderers, but they got aggressive and fired at officers. Then, in what's become a typical scene, the getaway vehicle was torched. Police believe 28-year-old Carmen Garewal, a member of the United Nations gang with a criminal record, was killed in retaliation for the death of another gangster.
These gang conflicts have continued. There's been more and more groups being formed, which has resulted in more conflict.
In the Vancouver area, 3 gangs dominate: the United Nations, the Brothers Keepers, and the Red Scorpions. But allegiances constantly change, and new criminal organizations are formed. According to BC's anti-gang police unit, they all have one goal.
These individuals, make no mistake about it, are vying for control of the drug trade.
That turf war has led to a rise in shootings in the past 2 weeks. On Saturday, outside a shop with surveillance cameras, a gunman shot and killed a 19-year-old with gang ties. Another person who just happened to be in the area also took a bullet, but survived. A week earlier, a corrections officer, Bikramdeep Randhawa, was gunned down outside a mall. But that's a mystery because he isn't affiliated with any criminals.
We're at a crisis point right now. And unfortunately, and I hope my predictions don't come to reality, that there's other innocent people that are going to be caught in this crossfire.
It's obvious these criminals have no concern for public safety. The shooting at Vancouver Airport was a blatantly violent act for anyone to witness. Robin Gill, Global News, Vancouver.
Now to the pandemic. Though vaccinations are increasing, millions of Canadians are under tight public health restrictions because cases are still rising in several provinces. Nova Scotia reported more than 120 new infections today. Its borders are now closed to all non-essential travel. In Manitoba, bars and restaurants are closed to in-person dining. Schools in Winnipeg and Brandon moved to online learning on Wednesday. And in Alberta, restaurants are now takeout or delivery only. Alberta still has, by far, the most active cases per capita, 570 infections per 100,000 people. That's more than double Manitoba, which is the next hardest hit province per capita. Despite the alarming trends, anti-lockdown protesters gathered again in Alberta over the weekend. Today, the leader of the federal NDP said there are parallels to those protests and far-right extremism.
To to brazenly not follow public health guidelines puts people at risk, and that is something that we've seen with extreme right-wing ideology, putting people at risk, not being concerned about the safety of others, not being concerned about the welfare of others. There is a connection, certainly.
Alberta's Justice Minister is refusing to apologize after suggesting the media, the federal government, and others want Alberta's healthcare system to collapse. Casey Madhu made the comment on Facebook while defending his government's latest restrictions. He said, "I don't think it will be responsible to simply wait until we have a disaster on our hands. That's what the NDP, the media, and the federal Liberals were looking for and want. We simply couldn't allow that to happen." When asked about that comment, Madhu's press secretary said he was referring to the increasing tendency of different groups, including the NDP, to exploit the pandemic for their own political purposes. The minister won't apologize for stating the obvious. Today, Alberta became the first province to start booking COVID-19 vaccinations for anyone aged 12 and up. And by 12 p.m. today, the Premier said more than 72,000 people had booked their shots. Ontario is also expanding its vaccine eligibility. Starting Thursday, people 40 and older can book their first shot. The province is also making it easier for some essential workers to get vaccinated. The Ontario Food Terminal in Toronto became the latest workplace to get its own on-site vaccination clinic. It is the largest produce distribution centre in Canada. Dozens of its workers were infected during an outbreak last month. And some good news today for high-risk healthcare workers in Ontario. They have been added to the list of people who won't have to wait 4 months for their second dose. Among those eligible are hospital and acute care staff in frontline roles, paramedics and other medical first responders, and long-term care workers. Bookings for the second dose will open by the end of this week. Despite the progress with vaccinations, Ontarians are being warned the COVID situation is still precarious, and the provincial stay-at-home order set to expire next week will likely be extended. While it may feel like there's no end to the crisis, what's happening now in the UK is a source of some optimism. For the first time in many months, England reported 0 deaths from COVID-19 today. Scotland and Northern Ireland also reported no new deaths. With infection rates falling and vaccination numbers climbing, new freedoms are finally on the way. Crystal Gamansing explains.
It's not every day you see a dancing bear on the streets of London. But this was no ordinary day. Boris Johnson said the words people have been waiting months to hear.
We've met our 4 tests for further easing the lockdown in England. This unlocking amounts to a very considerable step on the road back to normality.
Starting May 17th, people will no longer be forced to sit outside to have a meal with a few friends. Indoor dining will be added to the menu, along with movies, overnight hotel stays, and sporting events. All things banned in England since before Christmas.
Threats are significantly reduced, but there are still some residual issues.
I'm going to be doing your vaccination. Thank you. More than 35 million people have had at least one shot of a COVID-19 vaccine. Officials say that has directly reduced deaths by up to 80% and has reduced hospitalizations up to 85%. The extended lockdown contained the spread of the virus while buying time to boost vaccination numbers. Just like at the start of the lockdown, England's chief medical officer says the issue of concern remains virus variants.
We have a concern at the moment about a variant called B1617.2, rather snappy name, first described from India, and this is actually spreading from very small amounts.
Still, the experts support the reopening, so much so that physical contact, including hugs, are also set to make a comeback.
Whoever I hug, I can assure you it will be done with caution and restraint. I'm not going to act it out now.
No hugs for the camera from the Prime Minister, at least not yet. England is on track for all restrictions to be removed by June 21st. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
Rocket attacks and airstrikes in Israel. Coming up, what's triggered some of the worst violence in a long time between Israelis and Palestinians. The violence and counterattacks are escalating in Israel tonight. Israel's prime minister, who has failed to form a coalition after a fourth election, is talking tough again and launching airstrikes on Gaza after Hamas fired rockets at Israel. Gaza's health ministry says 20 people are dead, including 3 children. And there is fury among Palestinians after Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Redmond Shannon reports, and a warning: his story contains disturbing images.
More anguish, and now more death. A scene all too familiar here, and sadly almost inevitable, where a series of events have brought tensions to boiling point. Following days of violence in Jerusalem, more confrontations early Monday. Hundreds were injured in clashes with Israeli police at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site, sitting on Judaism's sacred Temple Mount. Worshippers stayed after morning prayers to defend the mosque against a march of Jewish activists marking Jerusalem Day, the anniversary of Israel's annexation of the east of the city. The march was rerouted. Monday was also a day where an Israeli court was due to hear the case of the proposed eviction of Palestinian families in the nearby Sheikh Jarrah neighbourhood. The hearing was postponed.
I think the Temple Mount is the place where nationalism and religion meet. This applies to Jews as well as Muslims. And it's a tinderbox, to put it bluntly.
Some Zionist Israeli lawmakers headed into Sheikh Jarrah, ramping up tensions further.
They don't accept the fact that Jews can go and on their holiest site, the Temple Mount.
They are standing with Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah against the evacuation plan.
And then, later in the day, rockets fired from Gaza toward Jerusalem, leading to Israeli airstrikes in response, killing Gazans, including children and a Hamas commander. At a Jerusalem Day event, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned the current confrontation may last a while. This latest crisis, arguably a political gift for the longtime leader, facing corruption charges and clinging onto power after another inconclusive election. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Ahead, horrifying heights. A tourist looking to walk on air gets more than he bargained for.
You're watching Global National.
If you're afraid of heights, this would be your worst nightmare. This tourist in northern China ended up clinging to the railing of a 100-meter-high suspension bridge. Gale force winds had shattered the glass panels on the bridge. It happened on Friday. Apparently, he was stuck there for 30 minutes before he was rescued. I guess you wouldn't be on that bridge if you had a fear of heights, right? In eastern China, a zoo is apologizing for not alerting the public for weeks after 3 of its leopards escaped. The alarm was eventually raised by residents who spotted the big cats. Surveillance cameras caught the leopards roaming the streets of a residential area. Search teams eventually found 2 of them. 1 is still on the loose. The animal park says they didn't report the missing leopards because they didn't want to trigger panic. A criminal investigation is underway. Up next, science meets history, how genetics helped unearth a long-lost sailor's past. There is a new, intriguing connection to a story that has fascinated the world since the 1800s. One of the crew members from the Franklin expedition, that failed mission to find the Northwest Passage, has been identified and matched to one of his descendants who is alive today. It is the first time such a connection has been made, and it's helping bring alive the story of what's believed to be the greatest loss of life in the history of polar exploration. Eric Sorensen explains.
It is one of the enduring sagas of the Arctic, the unimaginable ordeal for the 130 crew members of the Franklin expedition. The HMS Erebus was discovered underwater just 7 years ago, and HMS Terror 2 years later. But the remains of crew members had been found over many decades by the Inuit, and later came scientists.
This is a story of human endeavor.
Douglas Stenton is an anthropologist whose team set out to find who these men were and what they did.
The DNA analysis and these sorts of things provide a new lens, in a sense, for us to try and understand more about what happened.
It was an expedition through the Northwest Passage in search of the Pacific. The two ships, Terror and Erebus, made it as far as King William Island and became stuck in ice in 1846. The ships were found just a few years ago, much further south. But in 1848, after 2 winters and still icebound, the crew headed out on foot. Remains were discovered along the coast of the island. Some made it to the mainland. The remains at Erebus Bay would be a breakthrough. Stenton's team gathered samples from 27 crew members, then DNA tests from 17 modern descendants. They got one match. This is the skull of Warrant Officer John Gregory, and a conception of what he looked like in life. And this is Jonathan Gregory, a descendant in South Africa who sent his DNA sample to Canada, then heard back just last month.
We have a positive DNA match, and I literally had to hold on to my seat. You know, it was surreal. It was absolutely phenomenal.
Just as delighted scientists at the DNA lab in Thunder Bay.
Definitely felt good that we had actually made a match after all this time. It's just a small piece of information to the big mystery surrounding what happened.
There is much that remains a mystery around those fateful years in the Arctic, but one family now knows that a direct relative survived for 3 years in the Arctic.
And they know that he didn't die alone. There were the remains of 2 other men found at this site.
To be Jonathan Gregory linked to John Gregory, it's an important day for our family.
Gregory says it brings his family closer to their ancestors. Scientists hope it's just the first DNA match, that they'll find other relatives and learn more about Franklin's men and what they endured more than 170 years ago. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Monday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Queen's Park in Toronto. There are beautiful spots all over Canada. Please email us yours to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.